Hello and welcome back to the Exit Your Matrix show. So over the Memorial Day weekend, I decided to indulge a little bit and look for something to watch on Netflix instead of my stable, the Arc Drive. And while I'm on the topic, let me go ahead and get this out of the way now. If you haven't done so, you need to get an Arc Drive for yourself as soon as possible. This is the amazing repository of knowledge, Mark Passio's personally curated collection of over 26,000 audio files, 9,500 books, and 3,400 videos. You send him a 2 terabyte hard drive, he loads the data and sends it back to you. This is a mind-blowing, not only quantity but quality of data that you need to have. And I'll include a link in the description where you can find the details of the offer. Now, I'm extremely cautious about Netflix, not only because of the questionable veracity of the content, but also because it has very addicting effects on me. One just doesn't seem to be adequate. But I went into this very much of the mind that I was going to do my best to find things that had some educational or instructional qualities, and I think I succeeded. I stuck to documentaries and ended up finding a very consistent theme emerge in everything I watched. Now, it's definitely not what I think most people would come away with, but as far as I'm concerned, the similarities were absolutely striking. So what I'm going to do is go through each one that I watched and share what I think are the most important details, and then close it out by revealing what I found that consistent theme to be. And without a doubt, the most challenging part of putting this episode together was limiting how much detail I share, but I'm going to do my best. And one final item before we get into it, I highly recommend each of these. All right, here we go. First up is Painkiller, a 6-part dramatization based on Purdue Pharma's OxyContin pain medication. So you'd have to have been in a coma for the last decade or so to not know about this scandal, which is why I'll probably spend the least amount of time on it. But just like the others, Painkiller is full of some of the most treacherous, narcissistic, and greedy characters you'll ever come across, most of whom bear the last name Sackler, with Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler having bought Purdue Pharma in 1952. And here's the family tree with the other prominent name being Richard Sackler right here. Now, Painkiller centers around Richard, who's played by Matthew Broderick. For purposes of this discussion, the main takeaway has to do with a somewhat obscure name in the whole OxyContin debacle, and that is Dr. Curtis Wright. Yes, despite his highly professional appearance, he is a doctor, but now retired. Now, I contend that Dr. Wright is the most important player in this whole story because up until 1997, he was an FDA officer and was the person assigned to reviewing Purdue's application for OxyContin's approval. Now, assuming Painkiller is accurate, Wright originally strongly resisted the application, but as the story is told, Purdue worked every conceivable angle to win him over, at one point inviting him to a closed-door off-site meeting, after which he miraculously changed his mind and in 1995 approved OxyContin. The interesting part is that in 1997, just 2 years later, he accepted a $400,000 a year job at, drumroll please, Purdue Pharma. And after his retirement, a local ABC News affiliate in New Hampshire tracked him down in 2023 at his home, and when asked if he had any regrets, here's what he said, quote, "No regrets. I did my job. I never saw anything that I would not want to do. I do not know what the truth is. I have been treated very well by all parties concerned." Yeah, naturally. "I am now retired. It is a difficult, terrible situation, and I am so sorry for the people who are hurt and for the patients who can't get good pain relief now," end quote. No regrets. Bravo, Dr. Wright. Now we move on to Capturing the Nurse Killer, an hour-and-a-half long piece about serial killer Charles Cullen. Cullen ultimately confessed to killing up to 40 people in 9 different hospitals and 1 nursing home during his 16-year career as a nurse in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But here's the kicker in this one. Nearly every facility he worked at had strong suspicions that he was putting patients at risk, and some even fired him because of it. But not one of them disclosed their concerns to any of his future employers, so he was able to continue murdering people. He was eventually caught by police detectives in Somerset County, New Jersey, where he was working at Somerset Medical Center. He ended up killing 13 patients there. Add to this tragic story that a doctor at the New Jersey Poison Control Center who had learned of the circumstances, urged Somerset Medical Center to contact the police, which they delayed doing. And once they did, they lied and failed to assist in the investigation. The documentary claims that one motivation may have been that Somerset Medical Center was in the midst of an expansion and that the facts coming to light about Cullen might have jeopardized the financing they needed to complete the project. Now, after Cullen was arrested, Timothy Braun, one of the detectives who worked the case, did an interview with Steve Croft of 60 Minutes, and here's an excerpt. Braun, now retired from the Somerset County Police Department, told Croft he did not get much cooperation from Somerset Medical Center. Quote, "The hospital management was very helpful by answering court-ordered subpoenas, but that was the extent of their cooperation," end quote, says the retired detective sarcastically. When he and his partner asked for computerized records from its drug dispensary system, the hospital said they did not exist back far enough, a claim refuted by the system's manufacturer. "They lied to you?" asked Croft. "Yes, they did," replies Braun. Asked whether Somerset Medical Center had obstructed his investigation, Braun says, "They didn't try to help it, that's for sure." In the 3 months that went by between the poison control doctor urging the hospital to call authorities and Cullen's arrest, which happened very quickly, Cullen killed 5 patients. Now let's move on to The Pharmacist, a 4-part series about, surprise, surprise, a pharmacist in a small town outside New Orleans named Dan Schneider. This one is really interesting because it has 2 big elements. The first is the tragic murder of Schneider's son, Danny. Unbeknownst to he and his wife, Danny had a drug problem and was shot to death during a drug buy. Despite blatant laziness, incompetence, and disregard by law enforcement, Mr. Schneider started his own investigation. He finally found a witness by doggedly calling every resident close to the murder scene. A bonus in this one is that he recorded virtually every interaction, and you can hear for yourself just how useless and belligerent the cops were. And after he returned to work at the pharmacy, he started noticing how many seemingly healthy young people were coming in to get prescriptions filled for, you guessed it, OxyContin. He quickly figured out that there was one particular doctor who was prescribing the bulk of the medication, and being obviously sensitive to youth addiction issues given his son's situation, he went into investigative mode again after being bounced around between local law enforcement and the DEA. Turns out the DEA had been conducting an investigation for over a year when Schneider first started asking questions. Even though OxyContin overdoses and deaths in the exact area where he lived skyrocketed almost overnight. The offender was this tub of useless cells, Jacqueline Cleggett, a former doctor. She was trained as a pediatrician but got a pain management certification and opened up a crappy clinic in a seedy part of town, ultimately prescribing what's referred to as the Holy Trinity of OxyContin, Soma, and Xanax to an average of 76 patients a day and raking in close to $2 million in one 12-month period. Like all high-class physicians, her clinic opened at 11 p.m. at night, and get this, had a uniformed New Orleans police officer on site at all times to handle security. Schneider was finally able to get the evidence needed for the U.S. attorney to indict Dr. Cleggett when a 16-year-old girl and her mother came into the pharmacy to fill a prescription for the Holy Trinity, which given the dosages would have clearly been lethal since the girl weighed only around 100 pounds. When he called Cleggett to ask her if she prescribed the medication, she said she did, and when he questioned her, she said, "Who made you a fucking doctor?" In an ironic twist, not long after that, Cleggett was severely injured in a car accident and sustained significant brain damage. Now the final 2 here are the most challenging to summarize, but I'll do my best. Before I do, please take a minute to help me get this message out. This is wildly unpopular information because it's incredibly inconvenient, but it's still true. So subscribe, like, share, all of it helps. Now let's get back to it. So for these last 2, up first is Madoff, the Monster of Wall Street, a dramatized 4-part series. Like the OxyContin saga and Painkiller, there's been a ton of coverage of Bernie's Ponzi scheme, but there are some pearls worth discussing. To me, the most obvious is this man, Harry Markopolos, a forensic accountant, financial fraud investigator, and former securities industry executive. In each of the years 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007, and 2008, Markopolos was presenting the SEC with evidence and pleading with them to investigate. His claim was that Madoff's stated returns were mathematically impossible, with the natural conclusion being that he was running a Ponzi scheme and operating an unregistered hedge fund, which, by the way, if he had registered, would have subjected him to ongoing audits and made it impossible for him to pull off the crime. And here are some other gems. Early on, around 2000, the SEC called Madoff and asked him over the phone if he was operating a hedge fund, to which he responded no. And that was it. They took his word for it and didn't pursue it any further. And then at one point, in response to Markopoulos's allegations and those from other anonymous sources, the SEC sent a pair of junior examiners to Madoff's offices to take a look. They finally got around to asking him about the hedge fund activity, to which he referenced the prior conversation with the SEC, and again they took him at his word, packed up, and left. There were also some other world-class corporate scumbags involved in this one, with a number of household-name financial institutions with self-proclaimed state-of-the-art due diligence who were recommending Madoff's firms to their clients. Another is our good friends at JP Morgan Chase, where Madoff had a single bank account he ran all of his transactions through. Now this is Helen Davis Chapman, an attorney for Madoff victims. She said that Madoff could never have perpetrated the scheme without JP Morgan's complicity, which ignored requirements under the Bank Secrecy Act to monitor and report its clients' transactions, including anything over the amount of $10,000 that appeared fishy. JP Morgan Chase ultimately paid a $2 billion fine, and at the time of filming had pled guilty to 5 multi-billion-dollar criminal conspiracies, but it was not required to disclose the profits it made from any of them. In 2006, when Madoff was finally required to register as a hedge fund, he actually used it as a marketing tool, effectively telling potential investors that it was a seal of approval from the SEC. Then there's the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, a federally mandated industry member-funded U.S. government corporation created to reimburse account holders in the event they were defrauded. But get this, courts created a Ponzi scheme exception to the SIPC, thus cutting off potential recovery for the Madoff investors. But it gets better. In 1990, the fees the member firms were required to pay was changed to $150 per year. Not per account, per firm. So the SIPC would have clearly gone bankrupt had it been called on to reimburse victims the $500,000 per account that they should have been owed. And finally, we have Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee charged with liquidating Madoff's firm and obtaining whatever assets possible to return to investors. He came up with a plan to recoup funds from what were termed net winners, investors who had taken out more money than they had put in, which included amounts those people had paid taxes on. And guess how much Picard's firm billed the U.S. government for his work? In excess of $1 billion. And after all of that, several people said that it was actually the 2008 financial meltdown that ultimately caused Madoff's collapse, not Markopoulos or any of the regulatory meddling, with one saying that he probably wouldn't have been caught had it not been for the financial crisis. In the end, Markopoulos had some very instructive comments. He said this, quote, "I think the global financial crisis shows that you can't trust Wall Street. You can't trust the investment banks. You can't trust the Wall Street analysts. You can't trust the rating agencies. And you certainly can't trust the regulators. Madoff was a scapegoat for the financial crisis," end quote. And the final one on my Netflix binge-a-thon was How to Fix a Drug Scandal, which is a 4-part series about the Massachusetts crime lab scandals, and yes, there were 2 of them. It's centered around the actions of chemist Sonia Farrick, and also references misbehavior by another lab worker, Annie Ducan. Going at this Tarantino style, it was ultimately shown that Farrick was a drug addict who was stealing narcotics seized from drug arrests and using amphetamine, methamphetamine, crack, and liquid LSD on the job and while performing testing on samples that would ultimately be used in criminal proceedings. She also stole drugs and replaced them with fake substitutes. Ducan was falsifying testing results and frequently engaging in what's called dry labbing, or visually identifying samples without actually testing them. This was all despite testing over 500 samples per month, 5 times the normal average, and with supervisors and colleagues claiming to have never seen her in front of a microscope. In the end, over 35,000 convictions based on Dukan and Ferrick's tests were overturned. But a lot happened along the way, and here are some of the high points. When Sonia Ferrick was arrested, police found hundreds of pieces of paper that were listed in evidence records as assorted lab paperwork. We later find out that lawyers working for the Attorney General's office actively prevented defense counsel from seeing the documents. These government lawyers also lied to a judge, and he determined they had committed fraud on the court, meaning they also lied while under oath. As an aside, this resulted in one of those attorneys being disbarred. As it turns out, these documents were critical to the defense as they showed that Ferrick had a long history of drug use that predated her employment at the state lab. And not only that, but defense attorneys obtained emails showing that those AG lawyers I mentioned were communicating about the contents of those documents and knew that they could be devastating to the prosecutor's case, but they kept them under wraps. A very important element in this whole series of events was determining how long Ferrick's drug use had gone on and how many cases it had impacted. At a press conference where the Attorney General at the time announced the arrest,